This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast where we go beyond tights and flights to explore other genres and movies from the past. Each month we'll have a theme. This month we look back at the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and each week we'll pick a movie related to that theme. This week we continue our exploration of Lord of the Rings. Last week it was the Fellowship of the Ring. This week it's the Two Towers.
A new power is rising.
How many?
10,000 strong at least.
Let them come. Arwen's time is over. Let her go.
It's the ring. Frodo! It's taking hold of you.
The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, rated PG-13.
My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so by following us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host and creator of our new header is Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, I have a lot of distinct memories of the marketing for Two Towers. And the thing that they were really building up is they really built up that Helm's Deep battle and just how important and how significant it was. And it's certainly, even 18 years later watching it, Brian, I have to be honest in saying that even though I don't like the Two Towers in many ways as the other two Lord of the Rings movies, the Helm's Deep is still an incredibly impressive feat. And that's really what this movie's about. If you like the Helm's Deep portion of this movie, then you're going to probably have a very positive view. And if it's not your thing, then you're probably not going to like this movie very much.
Yeah, man, it's so hard to shoot action sequences at night, and we've talked about that so many times in the last couple of years. And they pulled it off so well, and you look at back at how they did it, it's all about the lighting, I think. There's something about the way they lit everything at night, because obviously there's no electrical lighting in the Lord of the Rings universe, right? So everything at night has to be some kind of natural lighting. They did it somehow. I think they'd had to do it like probably digitally and probably put some spotlights in the distance, you know what I mean? And kind of, I don't know, it was really difficult, but the fact that they had like so much white color and you were able to see the white color in the darkness, I don't know, they did it right, I think, and especially with the orcs and they're so like painted dark and everything. I couldn't believe how well the colors came out. And it's kind of a miracle, I think, and we looking back, because I know I know you're gonna complain about the Game of Thrones scene, and I haven't seen that scene yet because I'm kind of still 3 seasons behind. But I've seen the comparisons, and I totally understand why. Even 20 years later, how can a battle sequence be poorly lit compared to a battle sequence from 20 years ago, right? I get it. So still, it's incredible, very well done, and the way that they kind of break down each character's like not journey, but like each role they have to play in the battle. The comedy they throw in with Legolas and Gimli's great to kind of lighten it up and lighten the mood, because it's a really heavy sequence if you think about it. It's like it's the last stand for this kingdom, right? Because unfortunately the dude went crazy and sent his army away, right? So it's just like who's left, able-bodied teens and old men combined with the 100 or so elves, warriors that they were sent, compared to like the 10,000 orcs. It's almost like a 300 type of last stand kind of thing, and it comes off that way. And by the end of the battle, it gives you this hope when the army comes back to support their king. They shoo away the orcs. Everything's looking good, and on the bright side, the turn of the tide, so to speak. So overall, I think the build up to the battle was great. Even in the extended cut, I think they even did a better job because you get to know the characters a little more. So I think they did a great job, man, and it really pays off at the end. And they really built it up, especially if you watch that Fox special. I don't know if you remember, but I remember watching the Fox special. I think it was like August, a couple months before the movie was coming out, and then this was like right after the Fellowship and all the hype. Um, Yeah, and then the Fox special, they were just, oh my God, it's good to see these people. We're doing reshoots. We're all coming back. So they really hyped it up, and I think I was more excited for Two Towers than any of the three movies, just because it was something new, some new fandom for me. So I was really excited to see it. And then the big payoff with the battle at the end really was just incredible to watch.
I mean, it's amazing to think that so much of the marketing around this movie was about the battle. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of the movie isn't even the battle. I could make the argument that Andy Serkis and the team at Weta, their ability to create a full character, and there have been digital characters before this, particularly Jar Jar Binks, but I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we could say that that is not a great character. That is not a great rendering of a character. Whereas it feels like Gollum is the most tragic figure in this entire trilogy. And you saw a little bit of him in the first one. They made some changes to the design. And admittedly, I think there are some scenes that don't play as well, just from a CGI standpoint. But I am still, even 18 years later, incredibly impressed by what Andy Serkis and that team created. Gollum feels like a character. Gollum feels like he is actually interacting with Sam and Frodo. And we're going to be talking a lot about Andy Serkis this summer because we are not only reviewing Lord of the Rings, but next month, we will be taking a look at the modern Planet of the Apes trilogy. We're going to talk a lot more about Andy Serkis and just what an impressive individual he is as a performer and the motion capture and all that stuff. But I think you look at the performance, one of the things that's been said is that he based his performance on the cravings and the withdrawals of heroin addicts. And I think you see that desperation of, he's a drug addict. That is exactly how he portrays this character, and the look and the design of the character certainly lend itself to that as well. Andy Serkis was originally pitched the role of Gollum by his agent, who rang him up and asked him if he wanted to do 3 weeks voiceover work in New Zealand. That's how this started, 3 weeks of voiceover work. However, director Peter Jackson was so blown away by Serkis's audition that he decided to have him perform the movements for Gollum as well. And that is, again, last week we talked about how they came to make so many right decisions. And if they make any of the wrong ones, then you end up with a situation like you ended up with some of the Hobbit movies, and with some of the things that ended up happening to Game of Thrones, which I'm sure I'm going to reference at least a couple more times. But the decision to have him do the motion capture, the way that this performance is portrayed, it is just incredible to me. And I think the way that they were able to do it, I think is quite the feat.
It's just incredible because, I mean, the last year, as like I mentioned before, I've been working at a hotel in the middle of the San Fernando Valley. I've had my fair share of experiences with drug addicts and the like. So looking back now, and then watching his Gollum performance and figuring it out that he's doing a heroin addict kind of deal going on, and I'm just like, yeah, I've seen these people, and the Gollum is acting exactly like the people that I've kicked out at the hotel or my boss has kicked out. It's just amazing. It's just life perspective, you know what I mean? Because it's right on the money, and the way he's acting and the way that he doesn't take care of himself. And I've seen people at my hotel that are drug addicts that don't take care of themselves, and I'm just like, okay, yeah, okay, just please leave. And then I see Golem, and it's just like it's the same thing, and I'm like, holy shit, this is really ringing home now. So yeah, that was kind of eye opening, especially now watching it now. You don't really pick up on it, when you're as a teen maybe, but when you first watch it. But damn, it's just yeah, totally down that path, and he went with it, and it worked, man. Because it does become I mean, any drug addiction is tragic in itself. So taking that path with it and using that as the idea for the performance, I think or the inspiration for the performance, I think that was a genius move because it totally shows. It's even worse here than like in the cartoon. In the cartoon version, Gollum is not nearly as like fiendish. You know what I mean? He's more of like a creature, but here they turn him into this drug fiend kind of thing going on, and I think it really adds to the performance, and then the whole digital aspect of it all. There are some scenes that during the day, it doesn't look as totally rendered out because it kind of looks like the same color as the background. You know what I mean? His skin color. So there are some issues with that, but the other stuff at night, like when he's animated at night or like in a dark cave, it comes off really well, the animation or the CGI. So that decision was, right on the money because if they were gonna do something else, it would not have looked as smooth. You know what I mean? He had to have done that motion capture to get that down, and that's kind of been the influence, his influence on the industry because he went on to do what I think he played King Kong himself, and then of course Caesar. To me, like they should have created a new category in the Academy Awards, Best Digital Performance. But I don't know if you have enough digital performances each year after this point to have enough to have for an award like that. But because everyone wanted to give him some kind of recognition, everyone felt like he deserved some kind of Oscar, but there was no category for him to do that. So I still think, even to this day, that there should be some kind of either voiceover acting category for an Oscar Academy Award, because I always felt like Paul Newman in Cars was like should have just won an Oscar for that voice performance, but you can't give him an Oscar. So something like that, I feel like the Academy should kind of still to this day kind of reward digital artists like this.
Yeah, and I don't think it's just Andy Serkis. I think it's the team behind him that has also done such an incredible job. And there's also something else worth noting as far as voiceover work. John Rhys Davies is somebody who has kind of a double performance in this movie. And he, in addition to playing Gimli, he is also the voice of Treebird. And one of the things that's so fascinating to me is that there is no electrical distortion. They actually used just a wooden microphone to have him do the voiceover. And I guess for me, for somebody who is familiar with his voice, it was pretty obvious even back then, even though I wasn't as familiar, that it was the same voice as Gimli. But I still think it's genuinely impressive that they did this and that they had him use his incredible low baritone voice and deliver this performance. And I think the tree stuff kind of works sometimes. I think sometimes, I'm not sure how well it's aged necessarily, but they certainly made the right choice in bringing John Rhys Davies and having just another fully realized digital character.
Yeah, like the first time I watched it in the theater, I was like, "Is that Gimli's voice?" And then I started putting two and two together, and then I saw the IMDb page after I saw the movie and figured it out that he played dual roles. So I thought that was kind of cool, because his voice does fit that of like a giant. Because it does that whole scene with the ants. All those scenes reminds me of the Neverending Story with the rock creatures, right? I don't know if that kind of like reminded you of that, but that it was like totally the rock creatures and that voice even sounded like the creatures from the Neverending Story. So I don't know if he was going for that feel, but it definitely felt like it was one of those voices from the Neverending Story. And it just happened to be John Rhys Davies, who just happens to be Gimli at the same time. Because his voice is so unique. Like, it's got this weird, crazy accent to it. Like, you hear that in Indiana Jones, and it's just something unique about his voice and the way it sounds. So it's just no wonder that he's got this different range that he can pull off with these different characters.
One of the other things that is worth noting about this movie, in addition to John Rhys Davies having a double role, is in the book, which you have read and I have read, Faramir's refusal to seek the ring was very anticlimactic, and it's really not a big deal at all. Peter Jackson really felt like that was inconsistent, and because of the way that the ring has been built up, both in the books and the movies, it was felt as though that they had to make some changes to this part of the book. So it was decided that he would be tempted and that he would capture Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, and it leads, of course, to the moment where Gollum gets physically abused, and this leads to him deciding to turn on both Sam and Frodo. And I think for me, the problem with Faramir, especially in the Two Towers, I think the characterization is vastly improved once we see his father in the third movie. Unfortunately, if you are watching the theatrical cut, I think one of the issues that comes up is just the way that Faramir feels more like an obstacle. He does not feel like a character. There was a really important extended edition scene that we were able to see because, of course, we watched the extended editions. And it's important because you have Faramir interacting with his older brother, and we see the differences in these two characters. I think it's good for Faramir because we see him as a brother. We see the way that his father, Nazgul, treats him very poorly. And again, that's something that comes up in the third film. But in this film, it just comes across like Faramir's a dick. And again, just an obstacle. And I think it's a very frustrating aspect to this movie that the Frodo and Sam stuff does not nearly work as well as it does in even the first and the third movie when there's a clear beginning and a clear end. In this, they're just kind of in the middle of their journey, and there really isn't a natural endpoint. With Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, there's kind of this journey that they go on within this movie, and there's a battle that's won. And admittedly, it's not the final battle. There's going to be more battles to come, but it at least feels like there is a climax. Even Merry and Pippin, they kind of get their own journey, and there's a climax to it when they take out Saruman in his castle. With Sam and Frodo, you don't get that. You don't kind of get that satisfaction. I think they did a pretty good job with Sam's monologue, which we'll get into in a minute. But the Faramir stuff, for me, is probably the part of this movie that works the least.
Yeah, that's what I felt the first time, too. I felt like they're just, using this scene from the book and extending it to the point where it didn't need to be extended. Like, it was not that much of an obstacle, even in the book. Like, the spider is supposed to be the climax of the Two Towers for the journey of Frodo and Sam in Two Towers, right? The whole idea of, you see the scene in Return of the King, Frodo gets kidnapped, or not, captured by the spider, right? That's the end of the Two Towers, right? That's the big climax, So, I thought they should have went with that way because I think that's the more dramatic ending. Because I always felt like even when I was younger, like the whole Frodo and Sam thing, they just kind of get lost by the second half of the movie. They have this interesting, relationship dynamic they create with Gollum at the first half of the movie, and then the second half they're just kind of like standing around, and then Sam gives a speech. The speech is great. No, don't get me wrong. But it just feels like they were just standing around for the last half of the movie, and the whole focus was like mainly on Helm's Deep, which is fine, which I think it should have been. But like I said, I think you needed the spider to give you that big climactic ending to kind of to set you up for the third movie, like that big nail biter ending. So that's kind of the way I felt about it, still to this day. But you mentioned that deleted scene. It really, God, I mean, I wish they left that in, man, because that was so key. Like, you learn so much more about not just Faramir, but Boromir as well. Like, he loved his brother, and then, he tells his father to love his brother more, and his father's just a dick. You get more of that relationship between the three of them, and I think that was really lacking in the movies, because I completely forgot about those extended scenes too, and then I'm watching this, I'm like, God, no wonder Faramir is like this, the way he is, and he's trying to bring the ring back to his dad, and they really don't mention him in the relationship with his dad much, in Two Towers, the original cut, but then you see these scenes, and it's like, God, it's such a fucked up family, you know what I mean? And the wonder Boromir kind of went crazy, and then his quest for, he was sworn to protect the ring and protect Frodo, but then he's still conflicted with what his father demanded from him. So knowing that now, it even adds more intrigue to the last couple scenes with Frodo and Boromir and Fellowship of the Ring, I think. So it adds to that. So it's kind of a shame they didn't add that, because I think it would have enhanced the movie a little more. But I think that new line just said don't go over 3 hours. So like it was 2 hours and 58 minutes, just like the Fellowship of the Ring. So. I get why they did it, but I felt like they could have rearranged some things and give me that spider.
I don't know. I have very conflicting feelings, because I almost feel like if you're going back and forth between the spider and that final battle, I almost think that's too much at a certain point. So that's why I kind of have a problem with it. And I think the ability to do two big action sequences at the same time, that's not really something that we had seen a lot of up to that point. I think it's something that we might be more used to right now with kind of the Avengers, and especially I'm thinking of Infinity War, when they're kind of going back and forth between Wakanda and the battle with Thanos. But like for me, I think at this point, I think that's a really hard sell, especially because you're so invested in what's going on kind of in both places at that point. I think it'd be just really hard to pull off. But I think that the reason they took out the Faramir Boromir stuff is, I mean, it's obvious, because it kind of stops the movie dead, but kind of wish that there was a way that we could have gotten that scene either at the beginning of the movie or somewhere else, because I think it's so important for Faramir's character to really understand who he is. So it's the one deleted scene that I wish that they could have included in the original version. I alluded to Sam's monologue. So it wasn't originally planned. He was only supposed to say, "By rights, we shouldn't even be here," and then stare silently out the window. During the editing of the montage featuring the victories in all the battles, it was felt that a narration was needed. So they chose to combine this with Sam's scene. They wrote new lines for Sean Astin during post-production and looped it into the scene. We talk about decisions. This is a big one because I think what that monologue does, I think Sam has always been kind of a goof up to this point, and he's almost an antagonist the way that he treats Gollum and even some of his interactions with Frodo. But this feels like the moment when you understand who Sam is as a character, and it's so important for us to become more sympathetic to Sam's plight and to understand who he is as a person. And I think it's one of the best monologues in any of the three movies. And I think it really just, I'm not going to say it redeems Sam, because I think that he does a lot of work in the third movie that does it. But I think I always had a hard time with Sam up until this monologue. This monologue is what really sold me on his character. And knowing that they did this in post-production right at the last minute makes it all the more extraordinary, because, again, it's one of those decisions where if you take it out, I think our perception of Sam is very different.
Yeah, that's probably his like big dramatic moment because, like in the first one they did some comedy with him. They did some comedy here with the Golem stuff too. But this is a big dramatic moment that kind of turns you on the character into this kind of serious character that's there for the journey and not just tagging along, just being annoying towards Frodo. You know what I mean? So he kind of earns his keep with the speech, and then I just can't picture that sequence without it. You know what I mean? Because like it's so good and everything just kind of fits. Because if you just take the voiceover out and just go from scene to scene to scene, I don't know, it just doesn't have that finale or that final feel to it. You know what I mean? That ending feeling to it. I don't know. I just can't picture without it because it just fits so well. And just all three stories culminating at the same, not culminating, but just the three narratives kind of coming together at the end and kind of ending with that speech and how that speech kind of, crosses over into all three narrative scenarios at the same time. Battle of good and evil. We're not supposed to be here, And I get that, and it was nice to see, and I think what really adds to it is just the weariness, and he's so tired, you can tell, and he's just like he's out of it, but he's just still on this journey with Frodo, and Frodo's just like almost a mute at this point, just staring into space. But yeah, I think it's a really great scene, and that's probably his shining moment because I think that, and then some moments in Return of the King, but. He does. I think Sean Astin kind of stepped it up in this one, especially from the first movie, and then him interacting with Gollum still, his scenes with Gollum were really good as well. So he definitely stepped it up.
There is a couple more, one more moment before we get into the things that still work. One time when Bernard Hill was in Glasgow, Scotland, a woman came up to him and told him about how one of her children had died shortly before then, and the parents shouldn't have to bury their child. His confrontation with this woman affected him so much that he asked to have a line put in about it, and it is a line that still sticks with me when Bernard Hill says what he says about not bearing children. It's something that even today that I reference, and I didn't even realize that I referenced until I rewatched it, and I was like, that's definitely the first time that I heard it when I was 16, 17 years old, and it's really powerful. Bernard Hill is very good in this movie, and I mean, there are definitely times when he dials it up, but I think his performance is so good. And it's just even before the turn when he comes back to being kind of a conscious human being, when he's kind of just the crotchety old person who's completely unaware of what's going on. I mean, his performance is just very good throughout, and it's tremendously impressive, and that line especially really stands out.
Yeah, I can't believe that's where the line came from, right? I mean, I never thought the line came from there, but now that you mention it, that is probably the first time I heard that line. And it feels like, a lot of other movies and TV shows have reused that line in the past, you know what I mean? And It definitely is one of those most powerful moments in the movie, and I felt like Bernard Hill is borderline incredible in this movie. There's some moments where he's just so like brings so much real drama to the movie, and especially like he wakes up from this coma like state with you got Kevin Dunn there on his left or his right or whatever, and he's practically playing like old man Vince McMahon who's just taking whatever Kevin Dunn says in his ear kind of thing going on. So that's kind of the way I interpret it. But when he wakes up and then he finds out his son is dead, and it's just that moment is so hard to watch. I even, they do the extended cut, they show his funeral. I think it's more powerful when they cut to his memorial in the theatrical cut, because, like, where's my son? And then it just cuts to him at the grave. I think that's even more powerful, the way that the original cut has it. But, the extended cut, they wanted to show the funeral now. But, his performance when he wakes up, and then when he's making his decisions during the battle, and then he's telling Aragorn, "What would you have me do?" You know what I mean? Like, where was Gondor? Blah 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 to help us, blah blah blah. And then, despite how he feels about other kingdoms and whatnot, he's still willing to make the right decisions for his people. So it's really nice to see a king, especially today's age. You know what I mean? To see a king that's a fighting king and willing to do the right thing for his people. That's really refreshing to see nowadays, and especially today's global climate. So, he's one of my favorite characters in all of the whole trilogy, to be honest. Like, I thought, especially him during the battle and him willing to fight and make the sacrifices and make that last stand in the hall, and then burst out and just kind of fight the remaining orcs until Gandalf comes in for the save at the end. Tremendous stuff, man. And then some of the smaller dialogue that he has. He's just tremendous. The way he has to keep it all together emotionally after his son's funeral, to able to guide his people throughout. Just tremendous stuff, man. And he's probably the reason that the only person I like in Titanic is the captain that goes down with the ship, because he's the captain. So that probably makes sense as to why that's the only thing I like from Titanic.
You don't want to paint me like one of your French girls?
Not with a PG-13 rating.
Bernard Hill's great. I think he does a great job of both being he can be arrogant at times, but I think he's also really good at being empathetic too. And I think he's trying to be a good king, but I'm not sure if Theoden is necessarily doing a great job nonetheless. Because he does. The arrogance about Helm's Deep is kind of an issue, because just like the Death Star in Episode 4, there's a fatal flaw. Brian, what I'm waiting for is the prequel movie that's going to explain why that flaw exists, and it's probably Mars Mikkelsen's fault.
Listen, man, I played the Two Towers video game, and they emphasize that point too, because there's a big part of the video game where it's Helm's Deep, the battle, and then no matter how hard you try to kill that dude with the bomb, he just does it anyway. Even if you think that you're going to prevent that actual moment from happening in the game, the moment still happens no matter what. So, and it's not like they didn't know. Like, they didn't know what gunpowder, was it exploding powder, gunpowder, whatever you want to call it. They didn't know about it, and then Sauron created it. So there you go. It's kind of that representation of what Sauron's supposed to be. Because Sauron, I think, is supposed to be the representation of industrial revolution versus nature and the overcoming and taking over nature, and that's kind of what that symbolism was with the Ents, I think. So that all kind of fits together, I think.
Yes, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that makes a lot of sense. And let's get into the things that work about this movie. We have 3 brand new characters. The 3 primary new characters. I mean, we could talk about baby Carl Urban, but I want to focus on Theoden, Éowyn, and Gollum, played by Bernard Hill, Miranda Otto, and Andy Serkis, respectively. And I think that these are the 3 characters that we really get to know pretty darn well throughout this movie. And even though they're not a part of the Fellowship of the Ring, they still feel like they are an important part of this world, and the way that they are built up is really fantastic. And the way that Rohan, right from the beginning, I think the thing that I appreciate so much about the way that this movie kind of begins with the Rohan stuff is that we don't start with Theoden or Éowyn, but we start off with just a random two kids being put on a horse by their mom and being told to ride off to the next town. And I think that works so effectively because I mean, they're kids. It's easy to sympathize with kids. It really shows the effect that this war is having, not just on our main characters, but also that it is having an effect on everybody in the world. This is not just a problem with our kings and queens and main characters, but it's also affecting the pawns, the other unimportant people on the chessboard, and that's something that I really appreciate. But the fact that we have this character Theoden and the way that he's treated early on, it's like, what is the purpose? What is his purpose? Because he's just kind of sitting there with long nails and a big beard, and why should we care? And they do such a great job after that first hour, kind of snapping him out of it. And that scene with Gandalf bringing him back is so good. I just appreciate it so much. But Brian, I'm going to give you the opportunity, since we're talking about Theoden and that scene with Gandalf. Why don't you talk about a performer that is also in that scene that you really, really like?
My boy, not my boy, but one of the better character actors in the last 30 years, I think, Brad Dourif. I don't know, character actor? Yeah, I guess so. I mean, he's not really the major star of anything he does. He's usually the side character that's got the weird, quirky character traits, but he's the voice of the original Chucky doll. You know what I mean? He was in that crazy X-Files episode I mentioned last week. He's a great actor, and here he is playing this slimy. They call him a worm. They call him a snake. His name is Wormtongue. He reminds me of Kevin Dunn. I know that's kind of deep inside baseball WWE stuff, but if you kind of know the history of Kevin Dunn and Vince McMahon, and you see those two images side by side, you'll see what I mean. Because it definitely feels like Kevin Dunn and Vince McMahon, with Vince McMahon not knowing what the hell's going on anymore, which is more relevant today than it was 20 years ago. But he's just so good at being like creepy and slimy and like a pervert to the niece. I forget her name. Eowyn. It's hard to pronounce, but he's such a perv to her, and like I think they're alluding. They never show it, but I'm pretty sure in the extended cut that he had something to do with the son's death. He was alive, when they found him, and he was still bleeding out, but it seemed like he was gonna come back. But then all of a sudden, he's dead the next morning, and then they kind of allude to it, but I kind of had this feeling that he killed him, and that would fit with his character. Just a slimy dude, man. It feels like his presence created the curse on King Theoden. So, I mean, he just pulled it off so well. And the way that he plays the second in command of Sauron, and the way that he's just this, he's that yes man on the side, and he plays it so well. And then, I don't know if he was fake crying or whatever when he saw the army in the middle of the movie, but that was pretty, eye-opening. And I wish that he had more to do in the third movie. I don't remember. I think he had more to do in the extended cuts, but he did such a great job for that role. It could have been like a nothing role, but he, being Brad Dourif, turned it into something, something unique. And his paleness, I thought, was a nice touch too, with the black, pitch black hair. So I thought they did a great job with him, and he did such a great job for such a small role. But that's the whole point of a character actor, to take a side role and make it memorable. So he did a great job.
Well, and Bernard Hill is a character actor in a very similar vein, and I think you see what he does with Theoden. And Miranda Otto, I think we one of the things that we talked about was some of the issues with female characterization, and I appreciate that Arwen is not just a damsel in distress, but I think that one of the unfortunate things that comes about is this idea that she wants to be a fighter, she wants to be a warrior. This is something that is going to pay off in The Return of the King, but she is also jonesing for some of that Aragorn love as well, and you create this inadvertent love triangle with Liv Tyler's character as well. And I think that that's really unfortunate that Eowyn can't be her own character. She has to be a pseudo love interest or potential love interest for Aragorn, and kind of to see how that will eventually pay off in the third movie. So I think it's really unfortunate, because I think Miranda Otto does a very good job again of just integrating herself into this movie, and again Bernard Hill as Theoden does as well.
Yeah, they kind of slip in the fact that she's also kind of an orphan too, raised. She's the niece of King Theoden, so they kind of alluded to that. And then she kind of, I guess, not looks up, but kind of relates to Aragorn. Also, they kind of reveal in the deleted scene or extended cut here that Aragorn is 87 years old. Blew my fucking mind, but I guess he's one of those characters, or I forget what they're called, but I guess humans that have like a 200-year lifespan or something like that, and you find out that he died at like the age of 210, which makes sense. So it's almost as if he was destined to wait out the whole, first 87 years of his life just to be the king to come back and bring, restore order in the kingdom of Gondor or whatever. But yeah, I think she did a great job, and I wish she was in the main battle because I felt like they were teasing it, but they saved it for the third movie for that big payoff moment, which is probably one of my favorite moments in the whole trilogy, which we'll talk about next week. But they really teased it, man. But they kind of, were subtly tap dancing around it. Maybe the whole subject of, you're a woman and you should stay here and protect the kids and the women and children and whatnot, and she was like felt insulted by it. And she should be, you know what I mean? Because she's been training. She's probably more able-bodied than some of the people in the battle themselves, some of the older people, old dudes. So I get that. But they do have the payoff at the end of the third movie with the great line. So I guess they knew that they were kind of like alluding to it, and then they kind of paid it off in the third one. But I just wish she had some more to do in the Battle of Helm's Deep because I felt like she was ready for it, man, and they just kind of teased it, and they didn't give her anything to do except protect the women and children. But and it was weird too, because I don't know what it is, but she just reminds me of Becky Lynch, and I guess it's the accent and the hair, but just the whole like anti like I can do what a man does thing too. So I was like having like these flashes of like, why am I getting flashes of Becky Lynch all of a sudden? But hey, it's my WWE mindset, I guess.
It's funny. It's funny that you mentioned that because the wrestling comparison I was going to make is that Aragorn does a dive off of a ladder, and it reminded me of Sabu. Did you get those vibes too?
Yeah, especially since I'm watching ECW right now from the 97-98 run, and I'm seeing like these Sandman Sabu. I know we're getting off topic here, but these Sandman Sabu matches that are just so sloppy and poorly put together, but it's just so entertaining to watch in the worst kind of way. And Sabu is just going crazy off these ladders, and Sandman's going out crazy off these ladders. So I guess everything was just perfect timing.
Well, what is not sloppily put together is the way that this movie is constructed, and I think you get a continuation of some of the world building that happens as we go to brand new places. We get to see Mordor kind of up close. We see Rohan, multiple places, different towns in Rohan, including, of course, Helm's Deep. And again, the thing that impresses me so much about the world building is that they are constantly showing the geography and the distance between between various places. And I think what I particularly appreciate is the way that they show Helm's Deep wide, medium, and close constantly, so that you have an understanding of when the Uruk-hai are getting onto Helm's Deep, what that actually means, what that looks like, the flawed part of Helm's Deep. And I think it's just really impressive the way that this movie just continues to look, and how so much of it is done in camera. And yes, there is a lot of CGI going on, but so much of this is tangible. Helm's Deep feels like a real place, and it feels like a place that you could tangibly bring people to try and hide them, to try to save them. And I think that if you don't do that, if you don't make Helm's Deep feel real, if you don't invest people in the space itself, not just the people, then I think it's much harder to take the final battle seriously. And even the way that Rohan, just how windy it is, and the way that flag blows away that moment when Eowyn walks out. I mean, just those little details that they get right with the world building. And even when Sam, Frodo, and Gollum are walking through various forests, and they're going through the water, and Frodo almost gets absorbed by the ghosts of that river, or of that water area. I mean, it's incredible world building, even though we're in the second movie and we've kind of established what Middle Earth looks like, but we still are continuing to explore new places, and it all feels very different. And I mean, there are just some incredible landscape shots that, 20 years later, you could just send a drone up there and get all these incredible shots. But it's like they had to go to helicopters. They'd have people in the cameras and helicopters or planes or something to get these incredible vistas, these incredible landscapes. And even something as simple as watching Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas climb mountains, go down mountains, walk across fields. I mean, it just throughout this movie, I continue to be impressed with just how this movie looks and the fact that it feels like we are in an actual place. And that's why I got to give New Zealand credit, because it is a true character in this movie. And I think whenever you make the setting feel like a real place, I think that only enhances the movie itself, because look, investing in the characters is important, but it feels like Peter Jackson also went out of his way to make people get invested in Middle-earth as a place.
Yeah, I kind of feel like this has the best cinematography of the three, just for those massive wide shots, man. And you mentioned it, like those when they're just running on the top of that mountain. That's probably one of my favorite like visuals of the whole trilogy. Is these massive scenes of like nature and mountains and forests and the distance and like the hills and everything. That's probably why I like Rohan so much, just the way it's designed and the way that they built it in the middle of this like hill area or whatever, and then they build Helm's Deep. I mean, they didn't really build Helm's Deep, but the way they set it up is like it's in the side of a mountain, so you have all these different perspectives of like the mountain, and then the way it looks from a distance, and they add all this scope and scale to it, so it just looks incredible. Um, I, I don't know, just something about the way I don't know. I compare it to like the way the MCU did it in the last couple movies, like they're I mean, it's clear that they're using a lot of green screen. In some of these wide shots, it's clearly not green screen, and that just adds to it. Like you said, just these massive wide shots of actual nature makes it feel so real and grounded. Despite it being a fantasy movie, you feel the dirt, like you see the dirt. You know what I mean? You feel the grass beneath your feet, kind of thing. It just seems so real, and everything they're going through seems so real. So I think that kind of gives it an edge in terms of the visuals compared to like the MCU, where you look at like I mentioned in the final battle in Endgame, it still feels like this giant, massive green screen in the background. It might have, it didn't look as good as the Wakanda battle. I think that's because it's just the way that you get the natural look of things, and then it adds to it. So there's something to that, and I really appreciate. I don't know, there's something away about the way that they put the script together, despite my criticism of them not having the spider. But the whole thing of three different narratives and you're following each one, it creates this sense of like pacing that I think Infinity War in particular got from, whether it was like consciously or subconsciously. Like Infinity War and Two Towers are very similar in terms of pacing and the feel, the multiple storylines that you go back and forth from, and then because you have these different, three different narratives going back and forth, everything's kind of seems fresh, because then you focus like 20, 30 minutes on the Battle of Helm's Deep, and then all of a sudden you go back to Frodo, and it's like, oh shit, yeah, that's right, Frodo's still with Sam and Faramir right now. So it kind of makes you forget, and then it kind of is like, oh shit, and then it's like kind of fresh again. So for 3 hours, three different narratives, I think it works better in terms of the flow than Fellowship does. And I think this is because, just multiple narratives helps, and then at this point it kind of feels like this giant, massive show with these different, storylines going on. And I think Game of Thrones took a lot of that from that too as well. So credit to the screenplay on this one, because I felt like they really nailed down the beats and, the editing especially, and then the timing of everything. Because if you go too long on some stuff, you're just going to completely get bored, I think. But the fact that they had three different stories going on gets you engaged.
Well, you mentioned the comparisons to Game of Thrones, and there are times that I almost wish that they didn't feel as obligated to cut so much on that show to all the different storylines. With this being a movie, I think you have more of a responsibility to do that, because if you're just telling, like, you can't really divide the movie up into thirds and just kind of go this story, this story, this story. From a pacing standpoint, that's not necessarily going to work. But what I think you do get on the positive end is you get to understand the characters more. In the first movie, Merry and Pippin are just comedic side characters. And in this, because they're on their own, there are still moments where I think they try to keep them funny. But the thing that works so much better is that they kind of have to get involved in the best, that naturally forces them to have to be more serious. And I think that really works out, because I think that they could have easily just been written off as very annoying characters, but they kind of get a third of the movie to themselves. And I think it might be my least favorite of the three, because I think the stuff with the Ents, it also feels like they're doing some stalling and some obstacle creating for the sake of doing it. But I do appreciate the fact that they at least try to build up these two characters more. And even on the other side, I think the Gimli, I think, becomes a lot more of the comedic person in this. But John Rhys Davies is so good as a performer that he is just able to play it so well. Even though there's like a million short jokes, John Rhys Davies is just able to, with his physicality, with his line delivery, is just able to play it off so much better. He and Orlando Bloom have such a tremendous comedic chemistry. And I think that you even get to see Orlando Bloom shine even in the action sequences. Particularly, I want to mention the part in Helm's Deep when he rides the shield down like a skateboard and he's shooting dudes with his arrow. I mean, that is probably one of the most impressive scenes of that battle. And it's like a 30 to 45 second cutaway. There's also a point in this movie when you see a one take, I should say, of Legolas just randomly shooting orcs, and like he nails all of them in a single take and they don't cut. That was really impressive to me as well. And again, you get to know these characters so much more. And I think Sam's monologue is also a part of that. So the way that they built the storylines, even though I have my issues with kind of the individual storylines, I kind of have an issue with each one of them in a way. But I still think it was much preferable from a character building standpoint to kind of separate everyone out. And I do have to mention Merry and Pippin. They kind of so of course they're captured by the orcs at the end of the first one, and we actually get some funny orc interactions at the beginning of this movie. And I think genuinely one of the funniest lines in this movie is when one of the orcs tries to eat Merry and Pippin and he gets decapitated, and the orc loudly shouts, "Well, boys, it looks like meat's back on the menu." Genuinely one of the funniest things that is in any of the three movies. I still laugh even to this day.
Yeah, that's the old, I wouldn't say old, but like the old school Peter Jackson 80s slapstick horror humor. You know what I mean? If you watch Brain Dead, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And that's something that would have been totally in Brain Dead because that's the style of his humor. You know, when he's being serious, he's on a different level. But when he's trying to be humorous, he can be gory and, you know, just shit like that. And you see, I think what really added to it is you see the intestines fly in the air. I thought that was a nice little touch. But that scene in particular shows how crazy and nasty these orcs are, that they're willing to eat each other for meat. But yeah, just the way that, like I said, I think the narrative style, I mean, they all have their issues, like I mentioned before, but the pacing just really adds to it. So I think it was critical that they had to do it this way. Because I think even as I recall in the book, they do the stories individually, right? Like separately, and then you read them separately. Is that how I remember it?
Yes, they do. And Game of Thrones kind of does something similar. They're really, in both of those books, there's not a lot of cutting back and forth. It's like you read this part and then you go to the other side. And I mean, I can understand why that choice. I think you can make that choice a lot easier in a book. I think you can do either, but in a movie, I think it's impossible to not cut back and forth.
Yeah, I think that was one of the keys to doing it. And then, yeah, I just think that the Helm's Deep, I want to go back to Helm's Deep really quick. I just felt like Helm's Deep became its own character. I don't know if you felt that too. Like the way that it was built up in the movie and the way that you got to know it, it just felt like it was its own character in particular. But I just wanted to throw that out there. Yeah, a lot of things still work for me in this movie. So, yeah, I feel like it's slightly better than Fellowship in terms of the technical stuff and then the way that the script's put together.
I mean, I still think I prefer Fellowship on a story level because, like I said, I think that in the big picture, I think this movie works, but I still think that there is enough that kind of irks me, that bothers me, that to where I don't like this movie as much as the Fellowship of the Ring. And going into this, I was like, between Helm's Deep, which I think is incredible, between kind of the storyline, Sam's monologue, there's a lot of very memorable things. I think Bernard Hill is tremendous in this movie. I was like, what are the aspects of this movie that are not working for me? So I think that that's a good transition point. And I agree that I think Helm's Deep, like I was saying earlier, I think when you're creating a setting, I think you want it to feel like another character because it invests you even more in the movie. And I think that really works. But what I don't think works is the marketing in this movie, and then the movie itself, they teased Aragorn's death. So there's this battle with kind of these werewolf orc type creatures, and it's kind of a poorly put together scene because it's during the daytime and these creatures are very CGI, so it doesn't really hold up that well. And then there just comes a random point when this werewolf and Aragorn just fly off of the edge, and you're spending the next 20 minutes. They're trying to tell you that Aragorn may be dead. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, there is no possible way, because the marketing in the movie has already shown him at Helm's Deep. And that felt like a giant waste of time. I almost would have preferred they just showed Aragorn alive right away and not tease this fact, because it's not just the characters thought he was dead. They also didn't show Aragorn for a good 15 to 20 minutes until he does his big dream sequence with Arwen. So yeah, that is something about this movie that even 18, 20 years later, it still bothers me, because even back then it was very predictable that Aragorn was not going to die.
Yeah, it's like, why tease his death even though they already advertised a third movie where he's going to become the king at the end, right? I get that. It makes no sense. So looking back, and yeah, you're right, I was thinking the same thing. Like when they go head-to-head and collide, you can clearly see the CGI is not as smooth during the daytime with those wolf creature things, which was also in the video game, I think I mentioned. So that was kind of cool. I don't know if they just added that sequence for a video game in particular, but it felt like that whole point of it was just to get to the flashbacks with Arwen. So I get why they did it, but maybe they could have just got to that point in a different way. Because yeah, it did. That was the one action sequence that doesn't really hold up in this movie, only because of the way it looks and the CGI and the idea that he's gonna die in the middle of the movie. Because I was even thinking as a kid, like, of course he's not dead. What, why are they doing this? And then of course they show the flashbacks, and I was like, okay, I get why they're doing this, so they can bring her back a little bit. But yeah, it is what it is. It's not something that holds up well, but it was a fun part of the video game. I'll tell you that.
I think the Ents, they are a mixed bag for me, because I actually like that it's not the major characters that win the battle over Saruman. It's actually Merry, Pippin, and the Ents that do it. And the way that they do it, I actually think this sequence looks very good, with the trees just kicking things over, a lot of destruction going on, the flooding that happens. I really like that sequence, but especially when when the battle at Helm's Deep is going on and you're cutting back and trees are talking to each other. As a 16 and 17-year-old, I'm like, can we please go back to the fighting? Please?
Yeah, I kind of had the same feelings too, because like, I get the humor that they're doing, that they're slow, and it's kind of like the same kind of that humor that Zootopia had with the sloths. Like that's kind of what they're going for. But then again, it got too much when they were cutting back and like, yes, we just spent hours saying good morning to each other, and like it's night. Like I was like, ha ha ha, and then they cut back again, and then they're still discussing stuff. It doesn't really get interesting until they start destroying the tower at the end. It was kind of the stalling thing, and I get why they did it. And maybe they should have just cut back at all. Maybe just kind of focus more on Helm's Deep and then cut back to them at the end, and then they make that decision. But yeah, it wasn't. I don't know. They kind of just wasted time just having trees stand there and talk. It felt like, but I totally get that. And I guess they were stalling and making more obstacles for Merry and Pippin, but eventually they get to the point where it does look pretty cool, seeing nature kind of go head to head with industrial revolution going head to head. And then I don't know if you noticed too, but the one thing that really still works, that joke with the tree that's on fire, and then when the river comes, the dam breaks and he sticks his head in. I didn't notice that until the second and third time I watched it. That was when I was younger, and I kept laughing every time I watched it, and I still laugh to this day because it's so funny, because he's just going head first in it. And also, we forgot to mention, Wilhelm scream appears in the Helm's Deep battle. That's a shout out to George Lucas.
Yes, I believe the Wilhelm scream is in every Lord of the Rings movie. I believe it's in Fellowship and Return as well.
I must have missed it in Fellowship, but I do remember this one in particular because it was so obvious in this one.
And I think Faramir as a character, I was a little bit frustrated. I think this gets better with the third movie, but I think that for me, those are the things that really don't work about this movie, and I think that's why I still really like it, and I still think it works for the most part. But there are these little frustration points, and that's pretty much it. Anything else that did not work for you, Brian? Any other nits to pick?
Well, again, lack of female characters except for Eowyn, but like I said, they were building her up for that big moment in the third one. But still, it's still a lack of great female characters or leading leadership roles and stuff like that. But that's, what can I say? It's 20 years ago in the script writing, but times are different, so it is what it is. But the Faramir thing is like, for me in the original cut especially, like I felt like the Frodo and Sam stuff just kind of stops once they get caught, and then they're just kind of like, it's just like you mentioned, another giant obstacle in the way. But then when you see that scene in the extended cut, things just change your perspective on it. So that's kind of unfortunate because I still feel like, I don't know, like the first half with Frodo and Sam and Gollum, that was really good. But then once they get caught, it just slows down for them. You know what I mean? And they're just standing around and they're just waiting, and then they get released, and then it feels like they're even further back of where they were at the beginning of the movie. But I don't know, in terms of distance from Mordor, because they were literally at the doorstep, and then they got to go all the way back to Gondor, and then they got to leave Gondor again to go back to the doorstep. So it kind of felt like this unneeded obstacle that they kind of created just to avoid giving you the spider. So that's kind of my gripes. And of course, I wanted that spider at the end. Is that big climax? Because when I read the book, I was like, oh, big climax, can't wait. And then I couldn't wait, and then watched the Return of the King Warner Brothers animated movie like 2 weeks later. So there you go.
All right, let's get to the MVP. So again, we've agreed for all three of these movies, Peter Jackson is the MVP. This movie does not happen without him. So we really do just have to give our props to Peter Jackson. And we're going to probably talk a lot more about him next week because Return of the King won 11 Academy Awards, and it feels like that is the appropriate place to really sing his praises. But we have also agreed that we are going to do an on-screen MVP, the best performer. There's been a lot of conversation about a couple characters in particular. Brian, who is your MVP?
Bernard Hill, King Theoden. I just felt like he just really brings the real human emotions out of this movie, like the real drama of the movie, and that really gets me invested when you can invest in these human emotions in a fantasy world. I think that's really important, and he did such a great job of that from the moment that he's turned back from that hypnotic state, and then the way he changes back, and then just cutting to the son's funeral, and then him holding his emotions back and trying to keep everything together. Man, I thought he just did a incredible job. Like, even I would say he did even a better job than Ian McKellen in Fellowship to an extent. I just felt like he just brought some amazing realism to this movie that it needed. And if you had someone else play King Theoden, I felt like it would have just been this hokey, like stereotypical king role that we've seen before in past movies, like in Robin Hood type style of king or something like that. You know what I mean? He made it real, and he made you want to root for a king. That's usually when we have a king or a leader in a movie, you do not want to root for him because they're usually doing shady shit. But in this case, I feel he was doing the right things, and he was really truly a good king.
I think for me, there really is only one choice, and that is Andy Serkis as Gollum. Just the way that character was rendered, and the team behind Andy Serkis, I also would include as part of this because, it's not just the performance, but it's also the way that he looked and he was designed. And admittedly, it doesn't look as good as it did back in 2002. But there are still those little moments when he says certain pieces of dialogue, some of his actions, it still comes across well. Even the camera trick when he and Smeagol, when he's arguing with himself, and they do the camera cutbacks between Smeagol and Gollum, I still think that works, and I still think it really illustrates the differences between those two characters. And I do think that the tragic element still comes across incredibly well. And I have a deep admiration for what they were able to do with this movie. It's just something that I find to be incredibly impressive, and I have a ton of respect for Andy Serkis. He's of course gone on to do so many other things, but yeah, I really do find his work in particular in this movie impressive, and I definitely think a special Oscar was in order. So that's why I'm going to give this award to Andy Serkis, and you have given yours to Bernard Hill as Theoden. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens next week because we have not really talked a lot about Viggo Mortensen, and Elijah Wood as Frodo. Perhaps they will come into play at Return of the King as we come to the emotional and physical climax of this movie. So I'll be very interested to see next week, Brian, if those two end up as being our choices, because we kind of both agreed on Ian McKellen as Gandalf, and this week we had our differences.
Yeah. I was thinking about doing Andy Serkis too, but I just felt like Bernard Hill just gave it such realism. And no, I mean Andy Serkis was great, but I just felt like you get more of that tragedy in the third movie, especially the beginning, which we'll talk about next week. But I think the opening sequence with the history of Smeagol and the beginning Return of the King really hits it home for me in terms of the tragedy of that character.
And I think the other thing that is worth noting is what I appreciated so much about Ian McKellen. He is not in this movie nearly as much. And you could write it off as being a little bit cheap that they brought Gandalf back, but I do appreciate that Ian McKellen plays Gandalf the White in a very different way. Not arrogance, but there's a lot more confidence to this Gandalf, and there's a lot more assurance in his voice and what he's doing and what he's saying. And I really appreciate the fact that he played Gandalf so differently, because otherwise I think it could have come off very poorly.
I noticed that too. He was not even in the second act at all, which is great because when he comes in, it's like you forget about him at the end, and then all of a sudden when he comes in to save the day in the bright white, I thought that was really well done. Yeah, credit to him, because I think the fact that they leave him out so long, you know what I mean? It's like, how can I miss you if you're not gone, right? So that idea of missing a main character and then having him come back at the end and save the day, it's more effective that way.
Yes, and there is a Deus Ex Machina with Gandalf coming with the army, the Rohan army, that is also very similar to Game of Thrones. And I think that one of the things, as kind of the final point, is, I think it's really easy to look at the Helm's Deep battle 20 years later and look at and compare and contrast it to some of the other of the big battles that have been done. And I think there have been some that have been done really well. I think Endgame's final battle is one of the most incredible visuals that you will ever see in a movie. And in some ways, I think The Two Towers is kind of better visually because Endgame relies so much on CGI, but I do think that there is something to be said for how that battle has influenced so many other properties. And when I think about Game of Thrones and just how disappointed I was in the final season, the third episode of the final season is one of the most disappointing episodes of television that I've ever seen, because I literally could not see this battle. And there's been a lot of discussion about streaming it versus not streaming it, and whether it was really as dark as people made it out to be. Here's the thing. I streamed The Two Towers on my Amazon account, and I was able to see every single thing that happened in Helm's Deep in glorious high definition. It's inexcusable that 20 years later that there were so many complaints about what happened with Game of Thrones. And you can't just ignore it. And the fact that they just chose not to light it well is a major indictment, because just like with Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones had a major battle episode. It was literally the entire hour. They literally spent the previous hour doing nothing but a series of character building scenes that might have been one of the best episodes of the series. And then the very next episode, they go into one of the most disappointing. And I'm trying to stay vague because I know Brian hasn't finished it, and I know some of our listeners may not have finished it. But to me, it's so disappointing because Game of Thrones is different from Lord of the Rings. But in so many ways, Lord of the Rings has a very clear influence on the visual palette, on some of the execution, even on some of the story points, which might be more of a Tolkien, George R.R. Martin thing. But to me, the thing that is most disappointing is that Helm's Deep was not topped. And even though it is a television show, I wanted to see Game of Thrones do better than Helm's Deep. And ultimately, I think Helm's Deep is still the gold standard. And maybe that is a testament to how good Peter Jackson is as a director, because nothing in The Hobbit and almost nothing I've seen in the MCU has been as impressive. I think the Battle of New York at the end of Avengers, I could probably make that argument. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Helm's Deep, 20 years later, still really holds up. And I think that is the legacy of The Two Towers specifically, because I think with The Fellowship, you have a clear beginning. The Return of the King, you have a clear ending. Two Towers doesn't really have either, but it does have this incredible final battle.
Totally agree, and I don't know. I think there's just something about I don't know the digital age now compared to like because they were still using 35 millimeter cameras, for the sequences. So I don't know if it's just the high resolution cameras that doesn't give lighting you know the just due it deserves now. I don't know. There's something to that because I even recall Tarantino talking about this last year where how he's still doing natural lighting on his movies. He's kind of took a shot at Roger Deakins, who's like this world famous old cinematographer that's done all these incredible movies. He did 1917, but he's basically saying that nowadays what they're doing is just shooting digitally everything and adding lighting and all that stuff post. You know what I mean? In the editing bay. So I get the differences now, and that's probably the conflicting views on lighting today. So it's a unique situation because you feel like some of the movies from 20 years ago are just so much better lit, obviously with this Helm's Deep thing, and then you watch the Game of Thrones thing, and in this digital age, it doesn't come off as well. There's something to that. I don't know if there's just you need more, I don't know, more lighting lessons or whatever, or just everyone needs to get on the same page. But it just feels like there's this reliance on digital too much nowadays, and even in the lighting and cinematography, they're relying too much on just shoot whatever and then we'll fix it in post. I think there's not enough care on set anymore, and I think Tarantino's kind of on that, and this is kind of an example of that. So
Definitely, I think that everything you said, Brian, I think is very possible, and I think it comes down to the color palette as well. The MCU, there's a lot of gray, there's a lot of plain daylight, and that undoubtedly has a major effect on our perception of these movies. But next week, Brian, we are going to finish our discussion by talking about Return of the King. The extended cut of this movie is 4 hours and 20 minutes. Matt Waters would hate himself if he tried to do it, but we're going to, and I'm really excited to check out the Return of the King because I think it is an incredible climax. Even though there are way too many goddamn endings, I am very much looking forward to discussing that movie next week.
me too. And what really helped this second time around watching Two Towers is that we recently got this exercise bike for the house. My mom made me put it together. I got really frustrated because it had all these small parts, but I finally put it together and I used it for the first hour and 45 minutes of Two Towers, and it kind of helped. So I think I'm just gonna do the same thing and use an exercise bike for the first half of the movie, take a shower, chill for the second half of the movie, and just enjoy myself.
All right, so for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week to talk about the Return of the King.
So those Ent women, right? Where do you think they went? They think they just left their husbands and just took off, or did they get burned to death by Sauron?